Here's an E chord. Here is another E chord. Here is another E chord. And what's this last chord? You guessed it, an E chord. So you've probably guessed it. Today's video is all about mastering that dreaded E chord. I say dreaded, it shouldn't be dreaded really, but a number of the ways of holding down an E or an E major chord are quite tricky for a lot of beginners when starting ukulele. So I'm going to try and demystify it for you. I'm going to show you different ways of doing this E chord to make it easier for you. We're also going to explore what three notes make up an E chord. And you might think, oh, I'm not really that interested in the theory of it. But if you know which three notes make up a chord, you can then work out lots of different ways of playing it all over the fretboard. And some of those ways are going to be easier than others, so it's in your own best interest. So keep watching and let's tackle that dreaded E chord. So first of all, what actually is an E chord? Remember, if you ever see a letter written out such as E or C or D, any letter, and it's not followed by other letters such as M, A, J, M, or a number like 7, it's shorthand for a major chord. So an E just written out on its own is E major. And every major chord, if you remember from an earlier video I did on how chords are built, I put a link to it in the description. All major chords, are built by using the first, the third and the fifth notes of the corresponding scale. So this is the E major scale because we're building an E major chord. And the first note of the E major scale is E. The third note of the E major scale is G sharp. And the fifth note of the E major scale is B. Now, to make the chord, all we need to do is make a combination on the ukulele fretboard of all of these three notes, and they can be in any order. Different orders give you something called inversions, but don't worry about that. Basically, as long as we can find a way of fingering all three of these notes on the ukulele fretboard, we get an E chord. I'll show you what I mean in just a moment. Now, of course, we've got 4 strings on our ukulele, but only 3 notes here. So we have to repeat one of these notes. And to be honest, which note you repeat doesn't really matter. It gives you a different feel of the chord depending on which one you repeat. And that's absolutely fine. So what I've done is I've written out 3 ukulele fretboards here with these 3 notes in every occurrence of where they occur. And all we need to do to create different versions of this E chord, so we can try different ways of playing it, is make sure we're holding down each of these 3 notes plus 1 repeated in any order. So let's have a look at the most common way of holding down an E chord on the ukulele. And that's to hold down this E here, this G sharp here, this B here. So we've got all 3 notes covered that we need to cover, haven't we? E, G sharp and B. But we also need to repeat a note because otherwise we would only be playing 3 strings. And the way most people play an E chord on the ukulele is repeating this note here. So that's one occurrence of the E major chord on the ukulele. Let's look at 2 different ways of how we can finger that. So here's what I think is the easiest way to finger this version of the E chord. What I tend to do is I take my first finger, index or pointer, and I place it on the 2nd fret of the A string, the one nearest the floor. Then I take these next 3 fingers that I have left over and I place them all on the 4th fret in a row, almost like I was going to play a D-shaped chord. So I have my 2nd finger here, my 3rd finger here, and my 4th finger here. Now notice to squeeze them all into that fret, I have to stagger them. You can't have them in a perfect row, it just makes this too awkward to hold it. It kind of pulls back in the wrong angle. We can't have them too flat this way because there's no way they're all going to fit into that fret. So I put my 2nd finger towards the left-hand side of the fret, my 3rd finger, ring finger in the middle, and my pinky comes just before the right-hand fret there. And what I need to do is just experiment, making sure that I get a crisp clear chord, that's an E major. If you're getting a bit of buzzing or kind of chunking on this top string, it's normally because that finger there has crept back against into the next fret or over the fret wire. So make sure they're all comfortably in that 4th fret, index finger down here, and just experiment getting a clear, crisp sound. Another problem that a lot of people have with this way is that they allow their little finger to come down and just touch that A string, which then is blocking out this note here. So if you get this kind of noise, make sure you lift it up, raise that little finger up so that that A string is clear for this note here, and try again. This can take a bit of experimentation and work to get this to sound good. This is also where all of those good practices we learnt so far are really, really important. So having the uke at a 45-degree angle, to try and get that angle with my left hand, playing your ukulele like this is really uncomfortable. And that's one of the reasons I tend to try and encourage people to have their uke at a 45-degree angle. Remember that the thumb is going to be on the back of the neck. It doesn't want to be creeping up over the top because again that creates a kind of awkward angle here. It wants to be on the back of the neck, and I have that nice circle so that these fingers, it's just the tips of them pressing down. So take a couple of minutes, pause the video, play through that E major chord. If you find it's a bit not quite on the money, just experiment moving your fingers just left and right until you find that sweet spot, and that's one version of the E major chord. Now there's one more way that we can play this exact version of the E major chord, and that's rather than pushing all 3 of these fingers here on the 4th fret, which is the way I like to do it, but I've got quite small fingers. Some people find it easier to take just the 3rd finger and place it over the top 3 strings, okay, the G, the C and the E string. Now the important thing with that is that you have to bend it back enough that it's not blocking off this note here. If I was to flatten this finger over all 4 strings, I wouldn't have this note here ringing out. So it has to bend back on itself enough that this string here, this A string, is ringing clear. And it's quite tricky. It's why a lot of people struggle with it. So you have to experiment quite a lot of that and see if you can get it to work. Same practices still work here. So we need this 45-degree angle. We need the circle with the thumb and a relatively straight arm here. Again, if you can see from the angle, if I drop my ukulele that way, there's no way I can get a nice angle on that finger. Personally, because I'm not very double jointed, believe it or not, I actually find this one difficult to do, so I prefer this version. But as they say, your mileage may vary, and that's the point. The more ways we can experiment with playing this E chord, the happier you'll be when you find one that suits your particular body shape and way of playing. So let's now look at a different combination of these notes to play this chord in a different way again. We're actually going to start with the same triad, these 3 notes here, played at the 4th fret, just as we did in this version. So I'm going to circle this E, the G sharp and the B again. So far, so similar. Now, instead of repeating a B note, as we did here, I'm going to repeat an E note. I'm going to play this high E way up here on the 7th fret. Now, because that E note is a whole octave higher than this E note, here it is, the 7th fret of the A string, and here it is at the 4th fret of the C string. That's an E note, and this is an E note a whole octave higher. Because of that, this way of playing the chord has a real zippiness and brightness to it because of that high E note. So here's how we actually physically do it. What I want you to do is place your index finger or your pointer over the whole of the 4th fret. Now remember, the strongest part of your finger is the lowest part. So we don't want that tip just touching that G string. We want a decent amount of it showing over the top. We want that nice circle here with the thumb on the back so you can see daylight in the middle. And remember, when we're playing bar chords, we want this bar to be as close to the right hand side of the fret as possible. So we don't want it here, we want it here towards the right of that 4th fret. And then your little finger is going to come down here onto the A string, and it's going to reach across and it's going to press down towards the right hand side of the fret on this 7th fret, if you can see from my dots there. Okay, so you'll have your finger in between dots or before the dot on the 5th fret here, and this one is going to be on the dot of the 7th fret. And if we give that a strum down, a very nice bright sounding E chord. Now you might think, oh, there's only 3 fingers there, there's not showing as a dot there, but remember this note cancels out whatever the index finger is doing, so you do bar the whole of that fret and you push down all the way. It's the easiest way to do it, and then just give that a strum. This version is really nice. It doesn't work in every song because of this very high-pitched E here, but it's really neat for a couple of reasons. The main one, I think, is that it turns this chord, because it's covering all 4 strings, into a movable chord. So if this is an E major here, if we move it 2 back and keep that whole shape the same, we have a D major chord. If we move it up to an E major. And we're actually going to do that in a song in just a little while. If we moved 1 fret up from E, we would have F major. So that could be a really useful chord for moving up and down the neck. We'll discover that in a lot more detail in a later video. Now there's also a place we can play the E major chord in 1st position, right down the bottom end of the fretboard. And this uses an open string as well. What we can do is we can play the triad E, G sharp and B by playing an open E, this B here, and this G sharp here. There's the triad, okay? So we've got those 3 notes covered. But of course, 4 strings on the ukulele, so we need to repeat a note. And notice as yet, there's no note on the C string, so we need to put one in. So we're gonna also play this high E up here. This is a lot of people's favourite way of playing this chord because there's no barring involved with that index finger, but it is a bit of a stretch. Let's have a look at how we could play it. So the open E string is easy. We don't have to put anything down for that open E string. What we do need is a finger up here on that G sharp, which is the 1st fret of the G string up here. Then we're going to use our 2nd finger down here on this B note, which is the 2nd fret of the A string. Now before we put this little finger down for this E, just check that as you play those, that this finger here isn't flattening down and deadening those middle 2 strings. Nice and straight, remember. You'll notice I've got that thumb on the back, daylight in between, okay? And make sure all those notes are ringing out. Now to get it sounding like an E chord, we need to involve this E here as well. This is where it's a bit of a stretch. The way I do it is I take my little finger and I reach up here to the 4th fret of the C string. This 3rd finger, this ring finger, isn't involved. It might look like it's touching something, but it's just the way it's sat over the strings, okay? I've got 1 finger here, 1 finger here, and 1 finger on the 4th fret of the C string. Give it a strum. Now because it has that open E string, it has a slightly different tone and texture to the barred versions, particularly this one here with the high E. But another really useful way of playing that E major chord. So now we need to practice those E chords. Some of them are quite tricky, right? That's where it gets that nickname, the dreaded E chord. But with time and practice, you can get them sounding nice. We're going to use a song which uses the 1, 4, 5 chords from the key of A. Don't worry too much about the theory. That just means in the key of A, the 1 chord is A, 2 would be B, 3 would be C sharp, 4 D, 5 E. 1, 4, 5, A, D, E. And in the song that we're going to use, the E chord always comes after the D chord. Now in some cases we're actually going to change the way we play that D chord to make the E chord easier that comes afterwards. But let's look at the most straightforward way of changing first, going from a normal D chord to this open E chord here. Now, to land all three of those fingers down like that straight away with no practice is going to be really tricky. So as you practice this, go from playing your D major chord here and think of these fingers one at a time. Index finger comes back to this first fret, second finger down there on the second fret of the bottom string, the one nearest the floor, and then your pinky or your little finger reaches over here to the fourth fret of the C string. That gives you that nice first position E chord. So we can change from a D, first finger back, second finger down, and then reach up with that little finger. Let's do it a few times. D, 2, 3, 4, E, 2, 3, 4, D, 2, 3, 4, E. Notice I'm moving one finger at a time. Eventually you'll be able to build up that smoothness so you can get it almost straight away. What I want you to do is just pause the video and practice changing between those two versions of the chords and get really comfortable. Let's have a look at the next version of playing this E chord, which is to squeeze all three fingers, or you can do this version here. And we're squeezing all those three fingers into the fourth fret. And remember, this index finger or your pointer finger is playing the second fret of the A string. Now, you'll notice something about this chord shape. We already have this D shape here being played up here with these three fingers, right? So quite often what I'll do if I'm going to use this E chord and it's coming after a D chord is when I play the D chord, I'll actually use my second, third and fourth fingers. There's your D chord, so rather than those three, we're going to use those three. That means then we can just slide those up to the fourth fret and put that index finger down and we have an E. 2, 3, 4, D, 2, 3, 4, up it goes, E, 2, 3, 4, D, back it goes, 2, 3, 4, move it up, D, E even, sorry about that. So just take your time, pause the video and practice going between this D chord here, moving up and placing your index finger down for this E chord up here. So for this final version of the E major chord, which is played by making a bar over the whole of the fourth fret, and then putting our little finger down on the seventh fret of the A string. Now this one, we don't want to be coming all the way from this three finger D down here to then be going to a bar and your little finger up here. I mean, you can do it, but it's quite a big change, isn't it? Now there's something cool, remember I mentioned earlier about this E chord. If we take that exact shape back 2 frets, that is a D major chord. So just like there are lots of versions of an E chord, it's the same for every chord. As long as you're playing the right 3 notes of the chord, you can mix them up in all different ways so that you get different shapes. So believe it or not, by covering the whole of the second fret of my index finger and my little finger on the 5th fret, that's a D major chord. And then to change that to an E, all I have to do is move it up twice. And that gives me an E chord. So practice playing that chord down at the 2nd and 5th frets. And then moving everything up 2 frets higher for an E. We have a D, 2, 3, 4, E. Now what some people find is when they push down too hard on these chords, when they try moving them up, their fingers kind of squeeze together and they come out of the shape. So as you finish this D chord and you move up, keep your fingers on the strings, but take the tension out as you move up. Then they'll slide up in exactly the right position and you put the tension back down, you relieve the tension, bring it back, press, same in reverse, relieve the tension, move it up, press, and you'll get a nice clean chord. So practice changing between this D chord and this E chord, pause the video and come back when you're ready and you've mastered it. So for this first version of the song, just to learn it, what I want you to do is pick whichever version of D to the E chord you find most easy for now, okay? Normally for most people, they find one easier than others. Later on, I want you to experiment with mixing up the versions so you can get used to each one. But just so we can learn the song, let's pick the easiest. Now, for me, that's going from this D here, which is barring the whole of the 2nd fret and little finger on the 5th, and just moving it up to that E. Okay? And the structure of the song is the same 3 chords over and over with one exception. So we have an A chord for 2 measures. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we have a D chord for 1 measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. And an E chord for 1 measure. 1, 2, 3, 4. And that just goes round and round and round with one exception, which I'll show you in a minute. So let's practice that slowly. I'm just doing a simple down and up strum. You can do whichever strum you find most comfortable with this. It's all about those chord changes. If you find it easier, even just simple down strums is fine. So let's give it a go. You'll soon get an idea of what I'm on about after watching it through once, okay? 1, 2, 3, 4, A, 2, and D, and E, and we go again. A, and 2, and a D, and an E. Just keep that going. The tide is high, but I'm holding on. I'm gonna be your number one. This pattern is used for loads and loads of songs. Another famous version is Stir It Up by Bob Marley. So I can play the same chords. Stir it up, little darling, stir it up. A for 2, D for 1, and E for 1 measure. Fantastic, well done everyone. When I say 1 measure, we're in 4/4 timing, so 1 measure is 4 beats, so you can count to 4, once on a D, once on an E, and twice every time you play an A chord. Now the only different part in this whole song is that every chorus, apart from the first one where we start out, after we sing number 1, we hold a D chord down for another 2 measures, and an E chord for 2 measures. Okay, so the rest of the chorus is just that pattern through twice, and then we play a D and an E. I'll show you what I mean. 1, 2, 3, 4. The tide is high, but I'm holding on. I'm gonna be your number one. Back to a D. No. Again, D, number 1. And we're back to our original pattern. Every girl wants you to be her man, etc, etc. Let's give it a go. What I'm going to do is I'm going to play this song all of the way through so you can practice along. Remember, it's the same chords over and over, apart from the chorus where we have the extra D and E. What I want you to do this first time is, as I say, choose whichever chords, or whichever chord shapes rather, you feel most comfortable with. So for me, that's this barred D to this barred E. You might find it's this D to this E here. And I want you to just do that round and round to get really comfortable with the changes. Once you've done that and you feel really, really comfortable, and that could take quite a while because these are quite difficult shapes, I want you to rewind the video and I want you to play this song again through, and I want you to choose one of the other D and E shapes. Once you've got that, you can guess what comes next. I want you to try the third D to E shape, whichever one you haven't done so far. And that's a really nice way of practicing each one of those changes, finding which one feels most comfortable for you, but also having that ability to do all 3 can be really, really useful. And one of the things that I like to do is to actually play one version of the D to E chord for a verse and a different version for the chorus. And that kind of mixes it up and keeps it interesting for you and the listener. Just for now though, I'm going to play the same chord shapes again and again to keep it really, really consistent, so that therefore you can practice over the top using the different ones when you want to. Okay, chords will be on the screen. let's give it a go after 4. I'm going to do a chorus as normal, then a verse, then a chorus with that extra D and E, another verse, another chorus with that D and E, another verse, and then a chorus where we're just going to keep those chords going again and again without the extra D and E. You'll soon get an idea and the chords will be on the screen. Here we go. 1, 2, 3, 4. The tide is high, but I'm holding on. I'm gonna be your number one. I'm not the kind of girl who gives up just like that. Oh no, here's the verse. It's not the things you do that tease and hurt me bad, but it's the way you do what you do to me. I'm not the kind of girl who gives up just like that. Oh no, here's a chorus. The tide is high, but I'm holding on. I'm gonna be your number one. Another D. Number one. And D. Do that again. D. Number one. Another verse. Every girl wants you to be her man, but I'll wait, my dear, till it's my turn. I'm not the kind of girl who gives up just like that. Oh no, here's a chorus. The tide is high, but I'm holding on. I'm gonna be your number one. D and E. Number one. And again. Number one. Back to another verse. Every girl wants you to be her man, but I'll wait, my dear, till it's my turn. I'm not the kind of girl who gives up just like that. Oh, just keep repeating now. The tide is high, but I'm holding on. I'm gonna be your number one. Same again. The tide is high, but I'm holding on. I'm gonna be your number one. And let's finish on the one chord, an A major. Well done, everybody. Now, I think it's possible that I committed one of the cardinal sins of music playing there and sped up slightly as I went along. I was getting excited and enjoying that too much. But let that challenge you, and let that challenge your changing from that D to the E chord slightly quicker as we went along. And I meant what I said earlier. What I really want you to do is rewind that, play it many times, and do the different combinations of those different D to E chords. Find the ones which suit you and also add a little bit of variety. So we're going to do this D to this E chord, which is a bit of a stretch. We're going to do this D to this E chord, and we're going to do the barred one I was just doing up to this E chord. And I'd be interested in the comments to hear which you find most easy and which are more difficult for you. Now, I absolutely cross my heart and promise that will get easier the more you do it. It's just like that pesky B flat chord that we dealt with in the beginner's course, and that can take a couple of years to perfect, really, to build up the strength. Using all of those techniques we've looked at so far about the angles and the angle of your arm will help a lot. What I don't want you to do is be tempted to switch out that E major chord for another form of E chord. Sometimes when people see an E chord written in a piece of music, they'll swap out for an E7 chord, which is easier to do. It can work occasionally, but a seventh chord is all about creating tension, and a major chord is about kind of being grounded and a more solid sounding chord. So it doesn't really always work. And certainly never change an E major for an E minor, because an E minor chord is all about creating sadness, whereas the major chord is generally a happier, more solid sounding chord. So don't be tempted to switch them out. We've got different versions of the E major chord you can try until you find one that's most comfortable for you. And one last reminder, try mixing it up. It's really nice to try one form of E chord in the verses and another in the chorus. It's another way of adding dynamics and interest to your playing, which I think is a really good thing to do.